Jennifer Byrne has spent her whole career in clinical trials, working in more than 8,000 studies, so she knows a thing or two about the needs of pharma sponsors, clinical sites, and patients. As founder and CEO of Javara, Jennifer is spearheading a new concept, the Integrated Research Organization, or IRO. It's a novel model for bringing clinical research into the healthcare ecosystem. In this episode of the Health Biz podcast, Jennifer shares her journey, how it was influenced at various times by her father and her mother, and what she sees coming in the post-pandemic era. I'm your host, David Williams. Thanks for tuning in, and remember to subscribe to Health Biz. Jennifer, welcome. It's nice to be speaking with you today.
It's great to be speaking with you, David. Thank you for having me.
We're going to talk a lot about what you're up to now, but I was reading over your background. Looks pretty interesting. What can you tell us about your upbringing and education and your early career? How did how things evolved over the years?
Interesting journey, and I can, today say I'm very grateful for the journey that I had, but rather unconventional. So just by a little bit of background, I'm from Colorado originally. Spent some number of years in Texas and, now in North Carolina, and have been in North Carolina, Winston-Salem, North Carolina in particular, for a very long stretch. But the unconventional piece of this is my dad worked for General Motors from the time he was, I think, 21 years old, and he retired, had his head down, worked, and had that notion that you kind of stay with something and you go really deep on it, and you're super loyal, to the big company. Whereas my mom, I have had a vastly different kind of parental experience. Mom, probably much more innovative, entrepreneurial. I think when I was 8 years old, my mom had Christmas tree lots, fireworks stands, managed a motorcycle shop at one point, and at one point decided that she wanted to be her own business owner, and she and my stepdad opened or they bought Velma's Bar and Lounge in Durango, Colorado.
Nice.
So a lot that came with that, but I think the takeaway for me, there are really strong components. I think of, having one parent who has been very hyper-focused, super, committed to one organization, one line of work, and another parent, who had a lot of different interests and was always thinking about, kind of how to build on, different business, different way of thinking about things. So that's a very strong part. I carry both of those with me today, which some might describe to be a bit schizophrenic. But I think has been a really important part of my journey.
No, that sounds like it is, and some interesting places as well. I have been to Durango because my brother was actually chief of staff at the Northern Navajo Medical Center in Shiprock, New Mexico, and Durango is about the closest quote unquote, town, city, or whatever. But I don't think we stopped by the lounge while we were there. Maybe next time.
Well, I think the lounge today is actually maybe a Hampton Inn.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe we were there then.
Yeah.
So beautiful part of the world, and a really interesting place to be in. Yeah, I think it's interesting. People have their own experiences, and it's good that your father had the experience that he did. And it's certainly something that seemed like in America also of a certain time and a place that you could go and do that. And the idea of some people would go and they graduate. I don't know if this is your dad's experience, graduate from high school, you get the union card, you go, and it's, like, what's wrong with it, right? And you can own a house and you can support a family on one income and so on. And, for better or for worse, we're well past that time now as well. And it sounds like your mom was maybe in the vanguard with her entrepreneurship and adaptability.
Yeah, well, I like to think that, I have had the benefit of carrying, some of those really good, attributes forward. I think from a kind of pivoting to, my eventual, professional path, I went to Texas A&M, I got a degree in scientific nutrition, not because I ever was interested in being, no offense to dietitians out there, but I never actually, saw my future was as a clinical dietitian. It just so happened to be I started as a biochemistry major and transitioned to, the dietetic pathway because really the courses were interesting. It
Mm-hmm.
coursework that seemed kind of interest to me. It was health related. I certainly in college had an inkling that life sciences, health care is where I wanted to be. I'd had high school and college jobs in a hospital setting as a phlebotomist, and
Yeah.
so I knew
So
that
how old were you when you drew your first blood?
17.
Okay.
Yeah, 17.
Did
So
you get it on the first stick?
pretty sure I probably did not. I'm going to say I got it right on my last stick.
Great.
Yes, yes. So love that job. I mean,
Yeah.
actually, and really, I mean, in college, I was in the healthcare, healthcare environment. I actually covered the emergency room, and I covered intensive care, and I covered the maternity ward.
Okay.
So, a lot of customer service
Yeah.
and very different customer service. If you think about, patients in an emergency room, if you think about moms who have just had babies, and then you think about, really your customer base in an ICU, very, very different. So I didn't recognize it, of course, at the time for more than it actually turned out to be. But a lot of those experiences and principles have really carried forward. And then I worked all the way through college. I also was I worked at Fajita Rita's in College Station.
Nice.
And that was a job that really lent itself as a waitress in anticipating people's needs. And today, as I sit as the CEO of Javara, I mean, I feel every single day that's my primary job. I'm getting up and I'm trying to anticipate, what are the needs, what are the unmet needs of the customers and stakeholders. So
It's interesting, that the phlebotomist, as I'm thinking about that role, it is actually, I think maybe you have research on this. I think it can actually be really a critical element of the patient experience because it can seem on the one hand transactional. You're going to go, boom, get your blood draw. But there's the element of the person, of course, needing to be somewhat, calm and relaxed to have something, done to them that they may have a phobia about or whatever. And then the impact of if it's done well or not well. And that can be, of course, the skill of the phlebotomist, but also the kind of the patient interaction and what their state is like and so on. Someone may be left either with a bruise or they may feel really good about it. And I could see that as something that really kind of can carry through or could even be like a bright spot in a day for somebody, that little interaction. So just reflecting on my own experience and with my kids as well.
I mean, that is honestly, David, that's a brilliant insight. And I will tell you, I think that is something that pharma and life sciences have really underestimated. That there are so many solutions and technologies and companies, and there's so much around the patient journey. But from a pragmatic standpoint, you are exactly right. I mean, that winds up being, from a patient volunteer standpoint, that is a big hurdle as they're really understanding and learning about the trial or reading in an informed consent. I mean, that is something that's pretty universally understood,
Right.
right, from a health literacy standpoint, what that means. So you're absolutely right about that.
So we're going to talk about Javara. Now, how did you get to Javara? What were you doing immediately before that?
Well, I mean, what I have done my entire career has been clinical trials. So I'm going to go back to my dad. That's part of my dad. I
Yeah.
to just kind of fall into this career, and it became pretty clear for me. I'm going to say within month one, as a 22-year-old, that I probably had found my life's work. So I have spent my whole career in clinical research, and very, very specifically, I have been on the side of clinical research in terms of facilitating clinical research access and experience for patients and for doctors. It's a wide ecosystem, and you have clinical research organizations, CROs, and pharma, and all the other channel partners that it takes. But that's where I have spent my career. So I joined a company as an employee long ago. I was the sixth employee. As that company grew over the 27 years that I was with the company, I took on, new roles basically as the company was growing. Ultimately, became the CEO of that company. And in 2015, sold that company to a global CRO. So I stayed for about a year and a half after that transaction, and just part of the integration piece of it. I had a 1 year non-compete. And at that point in time, I was, 30 years into my career. And it was kind of that inflection point. Probably that's where, my
Yeah.
mother's influence came in. And I had an opportunity, I think, to really reflect on this next chapter, and do I reinvent myself and do something completely different, or is there more work to be done? And I mean, clearly, and I think any of the data behind the industry is very, very clear, there's a lot of work to be done. So founded Javara in 2018, and had the benefit of spending about a year, during kind of a non-compete period, of getting outside of, one organization, head down, working really hard day over day, building that organization, doing things the way that we had done them. And I had a year, of some exploration. So I spent some time talking to people that I hadn't really spent time talking to as much before, understanding, private equity and investors and pharma companies, and spending probably a little more time and seeing kind of how things were changing on the CRO front. And simultaneous to that, David, I think really probably stepping back a little bit and taking a little more note in terms of what was happening on the healthcare side of the equation. So it became pretty clear to me that there was an opportunity to think about a new type of business that inherently would be built around building better bridges between healthcare and life sciences, and to change that paradigm that when people participate in research, more often than not, people become, I'm going to say, a bit more disconnected from their overall continuum of care. Unless you are a cancer patient or you have rare disease. But pretty much, 50% of the pipeline right now from a drug development standpoint, falls outside of those categories. So that was really, kind of the thought behind, there's kind of a missing piece to the equation. And so, the concept of an integrated research organization was born.
Great. Well, that's a great story. It's good that you're able to have that year to kind of reflect on things. It's rare to be able to get that. I had a year not like that because I was at a much earlier stage, but I'd worked for a couple of years out of college, and then I had a year and actually traveled for a year, which was great, and it helped me when I went back at that time to business school to really know what I wanted to do and be in a much different spot. So that was good. And I always said if I had a chance to do that again, I would take it, but I had a chance at that time. And it's been 30 years and I haven't done it again. So maybe soon. Also, I think it's interesting your observation about there being more work to be done. I remember back kind of when there was, some industries kind of went through their ups and downs like telecoms. And I said, gee, I'm glad I'm in healthcare because there's a lot to do and I should have like a good career ahead of me. And now you think, not that I'm about to retire, but you say, well, gee, is it still going to be a mess by the time I'm done here? So there's more work to be done. And maybe it will be complete, or at least moved further along. So we're going to dive a little bit into some of the specifics that you're working on, but talk a little bit about kind of the state of clinical research overall in the U.S. What are some things that you see that are kind of key issues with trial design and how trials are conducted? And if you want to break it down into pre-COVID and during or after COVID, happy to hear however you're thinking about it, just sort of big picture.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, overall there is good progress being made. I'm just going to say, to kind of boil it down, to move more towards, that North Star of how do we develop trials and structure trials in a way that are much more personalized. So, the term that gets used now that's widely used is, virtualizing trials or the hybrid model. I like to think of it, in today's world, how do we better leverage, the tools and the assets that are there to, bring the right trial to the right patient at the right time. Along with, I think they're trusted partners. So healthcare providers, family members, because the clinical trial process truly is a journey, and there are a lot of complications to that. So I think that we are headed in a much better direction. I mean, goes without saying, in the past year, and the need for adapting in a pandemic, situation has accelerated things. I mean, my view on that is that, we would have been struggling with some of these models. We would have had a lot of resistors to adopting some of these models. And I think now, simplistically, with some of the bridge that's happened in the last year, and this has happened as a result of all of our shared experience, we found ourselves in a situation where, for example, telemedicine is not something that just happens in a big city or in a big system. I think that a good portion of the population has been exposed to this. So I think that kind of barrier has been lowered in terms of kind of trying new things. And for my company, we've had firsthand experience really at the front line in terms of speed and agility. And I think up to the past, the view on that has been, okay, how do we do those things to be more competitive in the market? I think people at the front line, it took on a whole different meaning, because it literally was a matter of life and death. It was a matter of, in terms of just our overall quality of life. So um, I think that I'm going to say, kind of, because of COVID, and on the other side of COVID, and there is another side, and it's coming. Maybe vaccine rollout is a bit more challenging than had been anticipated, but we will get on the other side of it. I do, see great and tremendous hope. I have to say, as a clinical trial person over the span of my career, which has been 30 plus years, I mean, I've literally been involved with probably 8,000 clinical trials. I've worked with hundreds of companies, hundreds of different companies, and a wide variability. But in the past year, I have to say that from a pharma standpoint, there has been an amazing level of collaboration and cooperation that I think is a real beacon of hope for the future. We have been involved, my company's been involved in some of the Operation Warp Speed, projects, high profile. So, in the public domain, we've been involved in the Moderna, work. We've been involved with Janssen, AstraZeneca. And I can tell you firsthand, I mean, these companies are sharing best practices. So, if you just look at the sequence of, Pfizer to Moderna, and, now, the next one to be approved, whether that's Janssen or AstraZeneca in the United States, there has been an extraordinary amount of just best practices, lessons learned in terms of how do we better reach underrepresented minorities and what those strategies have been. Those playbooks have been shared from company to company.
Now
And I
that's
think that's tremendous.
now that's great. I mean, there's obviously, this has been, if we look at 2020, an amazing year in terms of just the intensity of experience. But a few things in there that you point out, on the telemedicine side, it's something that's been available for a long while, but There are different assumptions about whether patients would like it, if it's convenient for the physician's office, and so on and so forth, have always kept it at a low level. And then suddenly it became an imperative, and boom, it was happening within 2 weeks in March. It was something like 10 years of progress. It's interesting. There's some organizations I know, like Boston Children's Hospital, that's actually kept it at a high level, and others that were sort of, regressed. And there's a happy medium, but it's be interesting to see where that comes out. I think also the idea of certainly clinical trials. Now everybody's aware of those if they weren't before. And then just what is possible in terms of how fast you can go. The warp speed uh, is, vaccines can sometimes be developed fast, but nothing like what we've seen here. And it starts to raise questions about, well, what other assumptions do we have about how long it takes to do clinical research, and what else could happen in maybe in the therapeutic area, and then just some of the technology like the mRNA. We really could be at the dawn of a new era here, and it is very exciting. So, how are patients faring in all of this? In terms of you hear different terms, patient engagement, patient centricity, and so on, and at the same time, I know from a standpoint of a sponsor of a clinical trial, they're not necessarily they're looking at the patient as, I mean, as an individual that they want to help, but also between them and the patient is maybe a CRO, a hospital, the physician, and so on and so forth. And they're kind of detached from the patient in a way, and this patient can be sort of at the end of the chain. So I'm wondering how are patients doing?
Well, I think that's radically changing. I think the brand identity of being a clinical trial participant has been immensely highlighted and celebrated. So I am hearing countless stories from trial participants that whether it's their family, people in their community, people who they go to church with, understand that they're in a clinical trial, they are being thanked. And over all the years, I can tell you, I mean, I those were not stories that were being shared. It would be more likely that, yeah, when I told my friend that I was in a clinical trial, the response was, "What? You're going to be a guinea pig?"
Yeah,
A much more negative. And the reports that we are getting, I mean, people are stopping these clinical trial participants and recognizing, that it really is a heroic act, and gratitude. So I love that for patient volunteers, because it allows all the rest of us who don't participate to be fast followers. I mean, that's exactly
yeah,
what's happening. So, and I think that as evidenced, every major pharma company, now technology companies, one of the large CROs that we work quite a bit with, Parexel, just announced the other day they, now have a chief patient officer. So, in the beginning, you have to wonder, okay, how much substance is really behind that? But I think that we are at a point in time where that dedication and that focus is very genuine, and there will be significant outcomes, that come from that. We have, interjected kind of just within our workflow, a technology partner. And so we're getting real time patient feedback. And so what that allows us to do is to course correct. And so to your point about getting feedback in real time about the phlebotomy experience,
yeah,
right? It gives us an opportunity that if we're getting feedback, right, from the trial participant that, hey, everything, was okay or was great with this experience, but I will never participate in another trial again because you stuck me 2 times.
yeah.
That puts us in a position, right, to be able to course correct, and to get it really right for the patient.
Jennifer, I want to make sure I don't gloss over something important that you said before, which was about playbooks being shared about how to encourage people to be in trials that typically haven't been in them. If you look at the typical trial population, maybe pre-pandemic, it's not a representative sample, and there's some real reasons, historical reasons, and other reasons for that. Can you say more about what you're seeing in terms of getting more representative, more fuller participation from patient populations in trials?
Well, one insight that has been really revealed to me, and so there's a lot of work to be done on this front. Um, so, a project, large scale project that I've been involved with that ultimately, kind of at the end of the day, brought forth about 20,000 patients into a surveillance, a COVID surveillance study. In this particular case, people were invited into this trial through their electronic health record portal. Okay, so widespread population, you're reaching out to 100,000 plus people, pretty low, barrier to entry because, pretty much anybody can participate. What was revealing that even with respect to highly efficient direct outreach methodology through an electronic health record, we were able to only reach 0.5% of a Hispanic patient
Yeah.
population
Wow.
and 9% African American, even though the local population for which that trial was reaching was about 15% Hispanic general population and about 25% African American. So, there's a lot of focus on the power and the ability to tap into electronic health records, but a root cause blocker is that there's distrust.
Right.
So while health systems are providing care to some of these patient populations, the distrust in people opting into a portal is significant. So, I think that's been a blind spot. I mean, I have to tell you, I think that that's been a big blind spot for pharma access to big data and the reliance on an electronic health record, right? And the insights with the electronic health record to reach those patient populations. So there's and this is not anything that I'm unveiling for the first time, but I think it really has highlighted the need. And so, there's a national organization, the ACRP, the Association for Clinical Research Professionals. They have as an organization, the mission behind ACRP is driving excellence through the workforce in clinical research. Okay, well, how do we better reach those traditionally that we have not done a good job in reaching? Well, we probably need to address the makeup of the physician investigator. We need
Right.
more, right? We need a more representative workforce, and we need a more representative base of researchers. Um,
Jennifer, we've been talking a lot about CROs, contract research organizations. I think that's a well-known term. You mentioned before the concept of an IRO, and can you say what that means and how it relates to what Javara does?
yeah, so again, we launched the company of Javara in 2018. And we came to market, my last company was really, what would be described as a site management organization, an SMO that was acquired by a CRO.
Got it.
But as a site management organization, in that model, it was really about managing in a more transactional way and facilitating research between a physician and patients really at a ground level. The integrated research organization, the pivot with an integrated research organization, which does have a legal construct. It's a very different legal construct because, and I can't speak to other definitions behind the IROs. And the last Google search that I did, we were the first group to really create the IRO term. I think there are about 7 companies now that are
Okay.
actually using that term. But the legal construct,
Paying you a royalty for it too, I hope.
we should have thought about
Yeah.
that. But the legal construct behind the integrated research organization fundamentally is a commitment from a healthcare organization that clinical research, basically the aspiration for the partnership is that we are building a partnership, not a vendor relationship, but really a trusted, trustworthy partnership that we are building together so that every patient within that healthcare organization ultimately has clinical research on their menu of options. So we're breaking down silos. So within an academic medical center, a trial is not necessarily just coming into, in kind of the traditional world, going into the Department of Cardiology and reaching the patients who are being provided care by the physicians within the Department of Cardiology. We're actually using a larger construct to where we're able to look at the data. We can go behind the firewall in terms of the identified, patient data, understand what are the unmet needs of the patient population across that entire organization, not just the Department of Cardiology, and really build those bridges. And and one barrier, David, is that oftentimes pharma will term a study and have a requirement for a study that it is being led by a board certified cardiologist. But when you really peel back the layers to the onion across the 50 to 60 inclusion exclusion criteria, that particular patient population, maybe who has atrial fibrillation, is now being actually followed by internal medicine physicians or family medicine. So the integrated research organization is really a way to cut across, and to reach the broader population. And, a lot of, mechanical, high touch services and kind of a technology component that comes with that.
Yeah, it's interesting what you're saying, and let me see if it relates to something that I was thinking about. If I'm a pharmaceutical company, I'm trying to do a phase 2 or phase 3 study, and I have my inclusion exclusion criteria. I'm looking for a set of patients. I may find them through certain physicians and so on, and that's kind of my lens. If I'm a patient undergoing treatment or prevention or whatever I'm doing, I want to think about, all that I'm doing. Might I enroll in a trial? But it's not like I'm all of a sudden when I do that, I think of myself as a clinical trial subject as my main identity. I'm a patient who happens to be doing this trial as part of what they're doing. And that concept, I'm not sure has really been there. I don't think it's necessarily the fault of the pharma companies. That's not their focus. But am I understanding right? Does the IRO have a role in that type of thinking for the patient?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, there is, certainly that paradigm shift for pharma, but I'm going to say the IRO is really a business model that is here in a way, I'm going to say, to leverage industry sponsored clinical trials. So, for 7,000 drugs and devices that are in development, I don't know that it's appropriate to think about a care option for a phase 1
Right.
project. But certainly phase 2, phase 3, there's plenty of opportunity. And let's face it, there are a lot of conditions right now that there is no other option.
Right.
So, what we're really doing in the IRO, we're contracting with pharma, we're working with pharma, we still have all the same, regulatory and data responsibilities. The IRO has really been created more as a service and a trusted partner to healthcare
Got it.
to leverage, right, in a hyper focused way. We're going to go get and bring as many of those trials that might fill some of the unmet needs of your patient population. And David, I know you are a fan and you have studied and you speak a lot about value-based healthcare. I actually see that the IRO actually becomes an opportunity to really elevate the whole concept behind value-based healthcare. Because if we have that opportunity to understand what are those unmet needs of the patient population from a cost standpoint or
Hmm.
just from a therapeutic standpoint, you now have an opportunity to build a portfolio of trials, right, across a population. And if you're kind of thinking about clinical research as a component or as a tool in that toolbox for population healthcare, then you have an opportunity, right, to in real time serve the needs of active patients. And it's not just that the trial participant is here to provide downstream data to answer a scientific question. So it really feeds into that whole notion of, building an important partnership in an active learning health system, reducing cost of care, improving outcomes, because the clinical trial process is a very high touch process.
Right.
And generally speaking, when people walk away from their clinical trial experience, they are a more engaged healthcare consumer.
Yes. No, that's right. That's really right. So it sounds like the IRO concept has gotten good traction through your own company, and the fact of the 7 followers or so is probably a good sign that you're onto something. How do you see this evolving? You already mentioned the pandemic will end, which is good news. Sometimes it doesn't seem like it is going to happen, but I think you're right. What's your 5-year vision? Where are things going?
Well, I definitely think that the concept of the IRO is growing and expanding. There are new companies that are being created, but I'm also going to say that I think that there's plenty of work now that's happening within larger healthcare systems where they really are thinking about the responsibility slash opportunity to bring forth clinical research to you, David, or to any of us as a healthcare consumer, because you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
So I think that clinical research participation in 5 years is going to be far more mainstream. I have a high degree of confidence that rather than less than 1% of the overall U.S. population participating in a clinical trial at any given time, and maybe even in an era of COVID, do we even hit 1%?
Right.
I see that needle moving. We have done better in the United States, for example, with oncology
Hmm.
participation, but that's even abysmal compared to Europe, for
Is that
example.
right?
So I think 5 years from now, we're going to see, a market increase in terms of the average American having participated in a clinical trial.
Great. All right. Well, I'll note that, and we'll come back to it in 5 years and see where it is. But it sounds like a great vision. I want to change topics here for the last question, which is about any books that you're reading, anything that you recommend to the listeners.
Okay, so at any given time, I've got usually kind of 5 books on my nightstand. So I'm one of those. I will juggle back and forth, but the book that I actually love and am rereading, so I'm reading this for a second time, is Jesse Itzler's um, "Living with Seal." Have you read it?
I've heard of it. I haven't read it, but you're a step ahead of me. You're reading it twice, so I'll make sure to read it. Yeah.
Well, it's funny, and it's he's kind of got an interesting way about him. So Jesse Itzler is a serial entrepreneur. He's married to Sarah Blakely. Sarah Blakely was the founder of Spanx.
Hmm.
Jesse Itzler has done a ton of different things, from fractional ownership of jet company to coconut water, to a lot of different investments. Now he's an author. There's actually a subsequent book to Living with Seal, but I think the thing about it's a fun book. But the thing about it is, it's kind of the spirit of putting your mind to something
Hmm.
and just that discipline. And it's kind of an outrageous, journey for those who have not read it. It's kind of an outrageous, probably something that only a handful of, those very few billionaires
Right.
can go to that extreme. But it is the idea about putting your mind to something and powering through it. The other book that I'm reading, which is very, very different from Jesse's book, is The Power of Habit. But there are some common denominators with that, and that really resonates with me. Sometimes it's just really a matter of really good discipline and focus, and the need to do that, especially when you're doing hard things.
Yes.
Um,
Good. All right. Well, that sounds good. Not just one, but 2 books. So it's a good stack. I think that's gotten a lot of people through the pandemic doing some reading. That's certainly a healthy habit, and try to ask everybody about it here on the Health Biz podcast. Well, Jennifer, I want to say thank you very much for your insights, for sharing your story with the Health Biz podcast today. It's very interesting, and I love your vision. And as I say, we're gonna come back to it and see how it unfolds.
5 years, I know. Document it. Let's see how we're able to move those numbers. But thank you so much, David.
You've been listening to the Health Biz Podcast with me, David Williams, President of Health Business Group. I conduct in-depth interviews with leaders in healthcare business and policy. If you like what you hear, go ahead and subscribe on your favorite service. While you're at it, go ahead and subscribe on your second and third favorite services as well. There's more good stuff to come, and you won't want to miss an episode. If your organization is seeking strategy consulting services in healthcare, check out our website, healthbusinessgroup.com.